These are informal talks, which means that I didn't even bring a shirt and tie along. It means I can wear a flannel shirt and get away with it. You all have a little apology in the Socratean style, stating that probably a lot of these talks are going to run a little long, and they'll be a little deep, because that's thick. Tonight will be an exception. Tonight will probably be the shortest talk, and it will probably be the thinnest and lightest talk, because it's sort of introductory to the whole idea of what we're going to do. The whole series of talks is called Christmas, Christ, and Christian Mysticism. Most of it is going to focus in the early talks on Christ, and in the latter talks on Christian mysticism. I've worked very, very hard on this, probably as hard as I worked on anything in my life. All of the notes, it was at least 15 hours per talk just putting the notes together. So we have plenty to offer. In the Rosicrucian teaching, we're taught that this is the holy season of the year. And it's holy for a number of reasons, and most of them I don't understand. In fact, all of these talks are going to be about things I don't understand. One of the things we're taught is that we're nearer to the sun. And one would assume that from that kind of propinquity, that the nearness has something to do with the holiness. I don't know that. I do know that to be near to people psychologically, and in some ways even physically, makes a difference. We also know that it's the time when in the northern hemisphere, the ethers have withdrawn. The riot of growth, of expression outwardly, has gone away. And with the inturning of the ethers, we ourselves turn in. And that by itself makes it a holy season. We also know that according to the Rosicrucian teaching, that the rays from the spiritual sun strike the earth in the northern hemisphere most directly. Now that's a mystery to me too. I've studied these teachings now for almost 30 years, and still most of the fundamentals are still a mystery to me yet. We know from simple astronomy that with the radiance from the sun, that in the northern hemisphere, let's say this is north, we know that the direct radiance from the sun is now striking the southern hemisphere. I don't know what it means when it says that the rays from the spiritual sun are striking more directly the northern hemisphere. I don't know if that means that there is a counter-Earth, or whether it means those that penetrate through and then strike at the northern hemisphere. This is not clear in our teaching. So what I'm trying to do is prepare you for the fact that we have, like all holy things, a lot of mysteries. And this talk is going to be, or all of these talks are going to be delving into mysteries or things that we don't know. Even though we don't know all of the whys and wherefores for this being a holy season, we do know the truth of it. We experience it. Our meditations are clearer. We're more willing to love. I think the reception that I've gotten here from every person to the last individual has been wonderful. There's love in the air. There is a willingness for people to go out spiritually. And that's the kind of experience we're having. That being the case, this is a time of the year where if we wish to be saviors ourselves, if we wish to save the world, to help out, this is the time of the year that we can do it. By turning inwardly as deeply and truly as we can, that much can we reunite with the Christ Spirit and move forward. So it is in that spirit, not so much tonight, but mostly in the future talks, we're going to try to experience the Christ and understand exactly what it is that we are aspiring to. And in that, take this and use it for the rest of the year, for the rest of our lives, to move forward to help the world. So we're dealing with probably the greatest mystery of all, the mystery of the Christ, which we're not talking about Jesus. In the next few talks, we're going to talk about the difference between Christ and Jesus. But we're tonight just going to look at this in an examination of the Nativity as the Nativity is told in the Bible. Now, this is not going to be a wide-ranging study of the Nativity, nor even a deep and thorough study of the Nativity. We're just going to pick up some things along the line and try to get the general gist of what's going on, and from there launch into the Christ mystery. Now, this puts me in a really tough spot because everybody is called to do a different kind of thing. And my particular calling has been in the same way that Paul was called to bring Christ to the Gentiles. My calling has been to bring the Christ mystery to people without the Bible. Each year I become less and less of a biblical Christian. And this is for a number of reasons, because I run into a lot of people who don't have it as part of their cultural background, that the Bible is an unknown to them. And I find it much easier to talk about the beings, to talk about the truths, and about the realities without the Bible. Another reason is because there's a lot of contamination of the Bible right now. There are a lot of literalists, and there are a lot of people that read doctrine, very materialistic doctrine. In fact, literalism is the worst kind of materialism. There are a lot of things that are read into the Bible, and people treat you very unkindly. In fact, the Bible is used by a lot of people almost as a weapon instead of as something that is a liberating force. So I've pretty much stayed away from the Bible. Another reason why I've stayed away from the Bible is because it's very anachronistic. It's not like our times anymore. It's not like the way we think. So I find myself in the very unusual position of being with people that are right now biblical in their orientation toward Christ, and so I'm going to have to revert back. But in all of this, are you familiar with Jakob Böhme? He's mentioned in the Cosmic Conception. Jakob Böhme was a most remarkable mystic. He was illiterate, and he was a shoemaker, and he prayed as he made his shoes. At least this is the story of it as I understand it. And he became a very devout man. And one day in his shoe shop, a great spiritual teacher appeared at the door and pointed to him and said, "You're going to write great books." And from that moment on, there was a direct awakening, and he was clairvoyant from that moment on. And he not only had to take what he found in his seership and share it with people, but he had to learn to read and write at the same time in order to be able to do so. In fact, he borrowed a lot of his whole cosmology, borrowed from Paracelsus, piecemeal. Almost broadcloth, he borrowed it. But after a while, he knew almost the entire Bible by heart. But his statement about the Bible was, as well as he knew it, he says, it's not the time for the Bible now. It's the time that we should perceive the spiritual verities straightforward. We should see them as they are directly, without a vehicle between us. And I felt that way for a long time. And even though my perception is not very good, I still think we have to try to look in that way. In fact, I've gone pretty much by the view of the ancient mystery teachings talking about symbolic vehicles, and the Bible certainly is a symbolic vehicle, is that the symbols conceal as much as they reveal. They open up things for you, but they hide things at the same time, and that's something that's made me a little uncomfortable. The Rosicrucian teaching has a number of warnings about the Bible, and I think it's wise to review them. Number one, the Bible has been tampered with. In some cases innocently, and in some cases maliciously. Things have been changed, things have been cut out, and things have been added. Another thing about the Bible is that it certainly is not the whole truth delivered once for all. On one hand, the Bible itself admonishes its readers not to take away from it or add to it, but on the other hand, if we look at John's Gospel says just in the Christ mystery itself, there's more than could fill all the books of the world that we know right now. So it's not the be-all, end-all. Another warning that we have is that the Bible is not a literal book of truth. It is allegorical, it is symbolical, it is indirect. And if we try to take it literally, we get in trouble. But in this, it is again a mixture. Some parts are very straightforward. Some parts you can read directly. The Gospels, which we're going to be looking at this evening, are not biographies. They're not meant to be a biography of the life of Jesus. And they are not histories. Certainly Matthew, who was an educated man, and Luke, who was a physician, had they chose to write a biography or a history, they could have done that clearly. They didn't. They wrote something else. And it's in that spirit that we're going to have to look at it. We also have to look at some positive things about the Bible. Number one is that it contains a formula if one is a Christian initiate. It contains formulae for seeing the basic principles, the basic mysteries of the cosmos. There have been a lot of people, and I remember, notice I said Christian initiate. For example, Madame Blavatsky is certainly an initiate, has wonderful understandings of things. She's not a Christian initiate. She's extremely reliable about everything that comes from the ancient world. She's very reliable about anything that has to do with the Orient. She falls on her face when she comes to anything that has to do with the Christian tradition. She mocks it. Though I sometimes wonder if she doesn't even there, if she's an obfuscating. Or we can look at somebody like Swedenborg. Swedenborg was devoutly Christian, but he was not an initiate. He has some wonderful insights into the Bible, but he doesn't have that very salient, the very central core of the initiate formula to be found in the Gospels. All right, so we've got some negative and positive criteria to keep in mind. I used for the few things that I'm going to bring out of the Bible, I've used the King James Version, not because it's the best, but because it's the most common currency. Probably something like the Moody Bible School probably have the best translations. They have labored hard to be very literal and very careful, and they give you dual language Greek and English translations, and they're very good about it. That's probably, if you want to get a good Bible, get a Moody Bible. I'm not pushing for them or anything like that, but that's just where it comes from. I'm not going to read much from the Bible either, because that's tedious. I don't like reading anything. Whatever you do should pretty much be live. In fact, I got terrible notes for these talks. Outside of the first one, a number of friends back home wanted to follow along with the talks while they're going over the 12 days of Christmas, so they asked me if they could copy the notes. And what happened is I had to take notes in a way that other people could read, and not the way that I read myself. Normally I just flash things. Okay, so let's start looking into the Nativity as it's found in the Gospels. And even though we're going to wander all over the place and look at all sorts of little fascinations, we are trying to get to some central points, and eventually we will make it. It's just that I'm a little slow. If the four Gospels, and there are other Gospels, I guess there are probably a large number of Gospels, only 4 were accepted by the Second Council of Nice, something like the Gospel of Stephen or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Eve. All of those Gospels were tossed out the door. I don't know why. They have some very interesting things in them. But of the 4 commonly accepted Gospels, only 2 have the Nativity in them. That brings up, one would almost think then that the material that is involved in the Nativity is not essential to the formula of initiation into Christ's mystery. I don't know that that's true, but it's something to toy with. I'll throw out a lot of things along the way because I'm not trying to say anything final. But the first common event to all 4 Gospels is the baptism by John. That's the first common event. In fact, that's one of the only common events for all 4 Gospels. All right. Let's look at the birth of Jesus then in the 2 Gospels that are there. When we do that, the differences between the 2 nativity stories are startling. They're very startling if you take the 2 and lay them side by side. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is born in a house. He's visited by wise men, and wise men who must have known well beforehand that he was going to be born. And he is gifted richly. If we look in Luke's Gospel, it's a totally different story. He's born in a stable or in a barn, and he has a spontaneous visit by shepherds, very common people. No gifts, but he is blessed. This is pretty astounding. In fact, it's very astounding that the same story has 2 totally different backgrounds. What's even more confusing, or what is more astounding, is that the lineage. If we remember, the Jews, especially the ancient Jews, were more concerned with lineage than the modern Mormons. It was very, very important who you descended from, what tribe you belonged to. But if you look at the lineage in Luke's Gospel and the lineage in Matthew's Gospel, they're different. And not just a little different, but greatly different. In fact, in some ways, they're almost not like each other at all. So you see and not only that, in one of the Gospels, the lineage is given forward, and in one of the Gospels, it's given retrogressively, and it goes backward. So when we're dealing with, you see when you're dealing with mystery books, when you're dealing with things that are meant to be opening spiritual experiences, you're confounded immediately if you try to solve them with a worldly mind. We can come to some conclusions about this. We can say that one of the Gospelers was wrong, which is a pretty horrendous thing. Or we can say that the names of the ancestors are something other than lineage, which I think is probably the best thing to look at it as. That, you know that in the same way that there are 33 degrees to Freemasonry, the ancient Essenes had 33 generations of the body of Jesus. And they all had to do with different stages of initiation, and it was the work of the Essenes to develop and maintain the body, the physical body that the Christ was to enter into. And so it wouldn't be surprising that for the Essenes that the names of the generations would be states of consciousnness. We know that the gods are built into our bodies. Everything that we do, from the way our kidneys function to the way our joints function, is an expression of some principle of some creative hierarchy. And similarly, if we look at the names of the generations, were we to look with the Hebrew dictionary and to look at what those names mean, it would be something more like a resolution of musical chords than like say so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. It's something like that we're looking for. Some people actually go so far, I don't know enough to say myself because I can't read out of the memory of nature, but some people go so far as to say that there are actually two different Jesuses, and that the lineage of the two is different. Should we throw more confusion into the pot? The confusion gets thrown into the pot because both of these Gospels claim that Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit. In which case, genetics is irrelevant, right? So there's a lot to look at here. But literally, in Matthew's Gospel, it says in Matthew's Gospel, the generation of the body of Jesus Christ. I forgot to bring my Bible. My goodness, in the haste to get my notes together, I didn't bring that. So you see that when you work with biblical Christianity, it takes a lot of insight. One cannot read it with a prosaic, with a material mind. One has to read it with the eye of the heart and with an inner eye, or else you're going to get into trouble. So that's just what we've done. We've gotten ourselves into trouble. We've dug a hole, and we're in a pit, and we have to leap out. And so we have three options. We can try to look at little interpretations of nuggets out of the Gospels, because we see that we just can't outright do it all. Or we can do a comparative synoptic looking at the Gospels. Or what we can do is just get the broad, big picture, the idea that it's pointing to. Being greedy, I want to do all three. But tonight we'll do just a little bit of the first two, and tomorrow night, And from then on, we will do the transcendental leap to the pure spiritual meaning. In fact, we'll try to look straight into the consciousness of Christ. So let's begin then by looking at specific symbols. And in that, we're going to run into so much that we're going to have to cut short everything. You see that in this series of talks, every talk could have branched into a whole series of at least a dozen talks, and in this one easily could have been much more. All right, let's look at some of the individual symbols, and from that try to get the spirit of what is going on in the gospel so that we can be introduced into the Christ mystery. Oh, boy. Let's look first at Matthew's gospel. That gospel that is the gospel of moral rigor. That very sparse gospel. It's a really tough gospel. And gospel that the Beatitudes are lovely, but in the next sentence after the Beatitudes, you're poking your eyes out if you're looking at the wrong things. It's a really, and if you even have the wrong thought, you're not going to make it. It's a tough gospel. It's very thrifty. So let's look at some of the things there. So some of the things I wanted to look at, and we will look at them eventually. In Matthew's gospel, the whole Nativity is covered in 2 chapters in less than 2 pages. And of that, the lineage of Jesus Christ takes up 17 verses, or 1/4 of the whole Nativity is spent in lineage. And it's given with 3 series of 14 generations. And the 3 series, this is like music, the notes are important, but they mark intervals. And the 3 series are bounded by 4 people or events. The first person is Abraham. The second person is David. The third position is the Babylonian exile. And the 4th position is from Babylon to Jesus. So there are 4. So you can say that it's the formula of 3 into 4. We're not going to look at that tonight. We will look at that tomorrow night. But this is a very sacred spiritual formula found in all of the mystery teachings, and that the generations, the 14 generations between each of those notes, so to speak, the 14 generation intervals, represent different phases of consciousness, and those different phases of consciousness, as they're pinned down to the material world through the 4 points, is something that we'll look at another time. As we've said, we've known that all of the patriarchs, we've been taught in the Rosicrucian teaching, that lived to great length, didn't physically live that long, but they lived that long in the etheric consciousness of their descendants. People were much more withdrawn. They hadn't come fully into the material world yet, and people were much more magically inclined, and they could take the events of their lives and press them into the bloodstreams so that their succeeding generations could see the pictures of their consciousness for hundreds of years. If that is true, it's not unwise then to assume that the different generations, the different patriarchs that lead to the birth of Jesus, represent metamorphoses in states of consciousness. We're trying to get at, since we're head people, we're very mental types of people and not really feeling full at all. That's our whole work, is to become feeling full. What we're trying to get at is a logical succession where one idea or one conception resolves into another. And in that spirit is the way we look at the generations. But I don't really want to go into that because that's pretty tough to deal with. But what I do want to do is look at some of the things, some of the hole that we got ourselves into. Let's look at the birth of Jesus then. Verse 1 of Matthew's Gospel unequivocally states the book of the generation of Jesus Christ. Verse 18 says, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Ghost. Now that looks like a dead contradiction, like direct. No doubts about that at all. Luke's Gospel, on the other hand, says it in a different way. It says, in a conversation with an angel of Annunciation, Mary states, how shall this be, seeing that I know no man? Which brings in the conception of carnal knowledge. So all of this is very, very curious, and it brings us to a point where if we're going to understand the Nativity, and if we're going to understand what this means in our consciousness, we're going to have to clear up a few issues. And so I'll get something on the blackboard so you have something for your eyes. The issues that we want to look at are insemination, and conception. Conception by the Holy Ghost, Immaculate Conception, all right. My handwriting gets worse as I get more impatient. Virginity, physical, moral, spiritual. What else? Carnal knowledge. So let's try to clear up these things in our consciousness before we proceed forward. Carnal knowledge, as we understand, this is something we can experience, but we experience it in a backward way now. Carnal knowledge means almost something different than it did in ancient times. According to the mysteries, at one time, our consciousness was so inward, we weren't aware of our physical vehicles. In fact, what was considered good in those days was anything that brought us to an experience or awareness of the external world. Even if it involved cutting another person or anything that brought us to that awareness. That was what was considered good. Much different kind of consciousness. This is what occultists refer to as the Lemurian epoch. At that time, it was very much the way it is now. The only time people really knew their own outward nature or the outward nature of another person was in an extreme sensory experience, such as coition. And when it says Adam knew Eve and she bore Seth, that is talking about a state of consciousness that we come to know the other person physically, that they're there. Otherwise, we knew inwardly. We had an internal picture consciousness that was something like watching your own private little video screen, and sometimes it was even in cartoon form. But, yeah, it truly is. Still does work that way sometimes. But in that act we came to know the existence of another person. To some extent, it's the other way around now. We're very dead inwardly. You know, if we listen to something like great classical music, we understand that those people not only feel, I'm talking about the composers, they not only feel all those feelings, but they can objectively put them out in such a way that you can experience and know them. And so we're, you know, the feelings that most people have now are only the coarser feelings. They have to go to thrill shows, or they have to go to rides, or they have to get angry with each other, or they have to be sexually united with each other. And in fact, we are so much in the physical now that sometimes the only way that we know that there is a living spirit inside of another person is through coition. It's turned around now so that we know that there's somebody alive in there only in that kind of union. So carnal knowledge, then, when it says in Luke's Gospel, seeing as I know no man, this is saying something about the nature of Miriam or Mary or whatever the name was. Miriam is probably the closest that we have in modern language to the name of Mary. That this is saying something about her. It's saying that she was a very inward person and could interact sexually without having a physical knowledge. Now, carnal knowledge is not necessarily sinful knowledge. However, when carnal knowledge is united with personal pleasure-seeking, or when it's associated with selfishness in any form, you know, the fall of humanity, the sin was not sexuality. The sin was the selfish use of sexuality. Instead of using it as a servant, either as a service, either using it magically or using it for procreation, that instead of using it as a service, we abrogated to ourselves saying we are going to be divine like the gods. And the ultimate sin is not sexual passion. The ultimate sin is the selfishness that's hidden behind it. And the same is true that if we seek carnal knowledge for pure pleasure, or for personal aggrandizement, or any other selfish end, that is where the sin is. It isn't carnal knowledge itself. Then we have to deal with virginity. There are several different kinds of virginity. There is physical virginity, and in some species, it is quite a common thing. Turkeys quite frequently procreate without there being coition. That is called parthenogenesis. But I don't think that's what's talked about here. That's not what's being talked about. If it were, Jesus would have to have been a woman. The physical body of Jesus would have to have been a woman's body. And there would be no reason at all, again, for the lineage of Jesus. Moral virginity is what we're speaking about. We're speaking about an entrance into the act of sexuality as a loving, giving sacrifice. Not seeking anything for self. And in that way, one can be morally virgin, not necessarily innocent, but certainly virtuous. One can enter into the procreative act in such a way that there is a spiritual purity, and the result of that union is the stuff of saviors. It is giving the best condition. We're talking about, where I live, the American Breeder Society is a very big thing. And people watch bloodlines, and they look into the procreative activity as a very serious matter. Spiritually, we should be doing the very same thing, because this is the very planting of the seed. The very, like if we're sending somebody off into the material world, this is the first act, this is the first deed for sending that person on their way and giving them an opportunity to go into the material world. And obviously, if we could do that without any taint of selfishness, without the first union of egg and sperm being in a attitude or is surrounded by a lustful feelings, that would be a wonderful, wonderful send-off. So moral virginity, I think, is what the gospel is pointing to. Spiritual virginity, we'll talk about that in another talk. We just don't have the time to get to it. I want to get to the, let's look at the first notion. You notice that they're separated from each other. Insemination and conception are not the same thing. Insemination is the planting of sperm into the womb. That is not conception. Conception is when the ingredients, how would you say it, the concentration, the residue, the concrete essence of all of our experiences in all of our past physical bodies and etheric vital bodies is placed into the matrix. In the Rosicrucian teaching, we say that the essence of all of our past physical bodies is called a seed atom. It is a focus of the material plane going all the way back to the Saturn period. Every form that we've ever had, the essence of that has been built into a viewpoint, into a point of consciousness that is called the seed atom, and all that we know about form we carry with us from life to life. This is placed into the sperm that is going to be part of the conception. All of our etheric bodies, going all the way back to the sun period, all of what we have experienced of vital life, of growth, of metamorphosis of form through life, vitality, the feeling of being alive, all of that is in a point of view called a seed atom of the etheric vital body. That is placed in the egg of the mother. And the conception is when these two are brought together and united, and then the materials from both the father and the mother build around this matrix the seed atoms are what we are is what we become. All of our past experience with form has a character. And according to that character, it attracts the right kind of materials to build the body that most expresses our physical understanding and our physical work in the material world. That activity, that conception, is normally an activity that is performed by the experts of the etheric life wave, the angels. The angels live in the ethers in the same way that we live in the physical world. That is where they carry out their most objective service. The conception work is normally the work that is done by the angels. And it's a very precise work. The time, the place, the whole attitude of everything is controlled by the angels. But in very special cases, this work is carried out by the chief of the angels, who is Jehovah. The highest initiate of the angelic life wave is Jehovah, who is the Holy Ghost. Therefore, when the Bible is saying that Jesus is conceived by the Holy Ghost, it is not saying that there was a coition of the Holy Ghost and Mary. It is saying that the etheric matrix in the womb of Mary and in the egg of Mary was prepared. And because one of the Gospels in here says very clearly, this is seer's knowledge, it says very clearly that this was done before the conception took place. And so the actual conception itself, which was an act of holiness between Mary and Joseph, but the actual conception where you might say that the sperm and egg were surrounded by the love and consciousness of Jehovah, the Holy Spirit, and that is what the conception by the Holy Ghost means. All right, we've cleared up some of the hole that we're in. We won't talk about immaculate conception, because immaculate conception is a spiritual term and it has nothing to do with the physical body at all, and we'll talk about that tomorrow night. It's a term that has been used in all of the mystery schools from the times of Plato on, and okay, all right. I'm skipping a lot of notes here because otherwise it gets too much. Let's then look at we promised we were going to start looking at some of the little nuggets along the way. And you might say that everybody that does a talk on the Nativity wants to take on all of the basic symbols and make their mark with them. And so we'll look at all of them, or we would be here at least halfway through the year. One of the ones I want to look at is the star. And I want to look at it from a number of points of view, because otherwise we tend to become very parochial about things. Obviously, the wise men were astrologers. In fact, in some interpretations, the Catholic Bible, for example, outright says that they were astrologers. Well, for about 30 years now, I've done an enormous amount of astrological work. I have sort of a free counseling service, and it's a wonderful thing, because I've had an education into everyone from street people and neurotics and maniacs to virtuoso musicians and all sorts of people. It's been a wonderful, wonderful education for me. But I have one rule that I have followed ever since the first horoscope I've ever looked at. When I looked at the first horoscope, it was one of the most humbling experiences of my life, because it could have been this. It could have been a blank sheet of paper. Because you know when somebody gives you a horoscope, even if they're joking about it, they're very serious. It's really meaningful to them. And in that moment, I realized that I really didn't know a lot of astrology. And even more so, I didn't know what a human being was. I still don't. To get a full grasp of a full human life and all of the attitudes and all of the points of view that a person has in life, I have not yet been able to do that. If I were, I'd probably be a perfected human being. But the one thing I learned, I took a try at it. I worked at it, and it's been a blessing that first horoscope was a tabula rasa, because I've treated every other horoscope the same way. I've treated it as though it were completely new to me and threw away all experience. Even if it's the same person that comes back. I've looked at some people's horoscopes maybe 30, 40 times and have tried to help them through different stages of their life. But every time I try to take it as a completely new person, a completely new life. Because you know how it is. You remember from when you first left home, you left home and you became yourself, and you came back to your parents and say, "Mom, I've changed." No, you haven't. You're still the same little boy I knew. And you know how it feels when your parents don't recognize the change that has taken place in you. people that you love very much have hardened themselves and they can't see the new thing that you've become. And any time we take any doctrine or any outlook and concretize it in that fashion, we have done that very thing. And so I've tried to look at every horoscope. It's brand new, like I've never looked at a horoscope before, even though I've seen this person before. And it's been fruitful. I've made discoveries about astrology that, it just keeps going on and on and on and on, and it's wonderful. Let's do the same thing with the star. Let's not look only at one interpretation of the star, and let's look at a number of them. A lot of them have been put forth by various people. One of them is that the star was a supernova. And that is believable to me. Even though it sounds like materialistic astronomy, there is paralleling in the development, the birth and death of a star. There's something that parallels our cosmology, which is a true cosmology because it isn't just materialistic on one plane, but there's something that parallels in the materialistic view of astronomy. And a supernova, when a star is renewed or it changes state and becomes something different, is very much like our concept of a Saturn period changing to a Sun period, changing to a Jupiter period. And it doesn't at all strike me as being unusual that at the birth of the Savior, that is going to change all of the consciousness of the earth, especially the earth that is so unique in its sinful nature. It isn't surprising to me that there would be a supernova out there. That's very believable to me. But that's not all that takes place. I did a little bit of research, and reputedly all of the names of the three wise men are Persian. And there is something that astrologers have studied for thousands of years, and the Persians more than anyone else. And that is what is called a trigon of Saturn and Jupiter. This is going to get a little technical for a little while, but it's so beautiful, the result that comes out, that it's astounding. It works out something like this. If Saturn and Jupiter conjoin in the first degree of Aries, 20 years later, they will conjoin about 242 degrees forward in the zodiac. And they will, let's say they'll about 2 degrees of Sagittarius they'll conjoin. 20 years later, they will be in 4 degrees of Leo. And so it goes something like this. And then the next one would be in Aries. The next one would be in Sagittarius. This is very rough. And so they keep making these triangles going all the way around the entire zodiac. Oh boy, how adventurous are you? How much do you want to go into it? All right. Saturn and Jupiter mark the top of the ladder of the stars, the ladder of rising into heaven. If we live on the earth, this goes by the apparent speed of planets. We live on the earth. The first step on the ladder is called the moon. The next step on the ladder is called Mercury, because Mercury is the next fastest moving planet. The next step is called Venus. The central rung on the ladder is the Sun. The next step is Mars. The next step is Jupiter. The next step is Saturn. And these phenomenal planets represent Jacob's ladder, where we climb from the earth to heaven. The outer spiritual realms are associated with Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto in that order. This is called the firmament. This is called the crystallium. And this is called the primum mobile. And the phenomenal planets relate to the phenomenal parts of our being, the concrete parts of our being, and the transcendental planets relate to the universal spiritual parts of our being. The creative things come from the spirit. And so Saturn is the porter. Saturn is the gatekeeper, where things come in through Saturn and things go out through Saturn. Like, for example, in the Rosicrucian cosmos conception, the rings of Saturn are called dispersing agencies into the gateway of chaos. The area of Aquarius and Pisces to the ancients, to the mystery teachings of the ancients, as well as in the Rosicrucian teaching, were called chaos, outer darkness. And the rings of Saturn represent things that are being taken from the material realms and dispersed back into the spiritual realms. So conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter represent when new things are coming in or when new things are going out. This has been traced for many hundreds of years in history. I'd like to go into a whole bunch of details about this, but it would end up being an astrology talk, and it would not end up being a talk about the Nativity, and it would be very long, and it would be fun, but it wouldn't be what we're trying to get to. But every 20 years is a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. The great historian Toynbee has followed risings and fallings of different kinds of cultural movements to 20-year periods. Thomas Jefferson wanted to have a revolution every 20 years to keep the country pure and rejuvenescent. Well, after so many conjunctions at several hundred years, there is another level of Saturn and Jupiter conjunction. That is, after they've worked their way through the fiery signs, then they change elements. So that's a second level. Let's just say X hundred years. And when they go all through all four elements, which is something that happens every few thousand years, that's a third level. Let's call that one Y00. That's in the thousands of years. And the grand case is when Saturn and Jupiter conjoin, and they conjoin as close as they possibly can to the first degree of Aries. Because sometimes the first time the one that just recently happened, the 1980 conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, was the first one in an Aries sign. And that was in Libra. And the Libra in the United States chart has to do with education. So that means for the next several hundred years in the United States, education is going to be a big issue. The first one in earthy signs occurred in the 8th house in the United States chart. And every president that was born under a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter while in the earthy signs died in office. They were all killed in office. The 2001, when the next time they conjoin, it's either 2000 or 2001. That's going to be back in an earthy sign again. It's not going to be in an Aries sign. But you can see that there are cycles that carry all the way through these different levels. And this is in the XY000 when it occurs right next to the first degree of Aries. This is what happened in 7 BC. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus was born in 7 BC, though some people would like to say those kinds of things. But I am saying that the times were set at 7 BC for a magnum event of something that happens in terms of tens of thousands of years. Now, another thing about it is that this conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter occurred in, are you familiar with the way the constellations look? It occurred, Aries sits there like that, and that's sort of what its head looks like. This conjunction occurred, right here somewhere is between, in fact, the upper fish is partly in Aries, and the other fish is in its own area. And this is where the beginning of the sidereal zodiac is. This conjunction that occurred at 7 BC occurred. I have terrible time with the Hebrew pronunciations. It occurred next to a star called Mizartim. And Mizartim is another interpretation for the Star of Jesus. So we're now on our third interpretation for the Star of Jesus, and that is that the first one is that it may have been a supernova. The second one is that it's Saturn and Jupiter conjunction of a very great magnitude. But that Saturn-Jupiter conjunction occurred near Mizartim. And Mizartim itself is called the Star of Jesus. It is also called the Star of Joshua, because in the Hebrew, Joshua, Jeshur, Jesus are all the same name. They have the same root. Remember, the Promised Land, Moses was not allowed to enter the Promised Land, but it was Joshua who blew the ram's horn. See, the whole Bible is a sidereal myth. It's a sidereal myth of great magnitude, and it has great meaning. This is the ram's horn. This is sort of like the attitude that Paul talks about when he says, if the trumpet sound an uncertain note, who shall come to battle? And this is the proclamation. The walls come tumbling down. This is the one that Moses pointed to. So this conjunction and this star all point to the same thing. A very few years later, the equinox passed there. Got to here about 496 A.D. That's the Second Council of Nice, when all of the ancient world was declared heresy immediately. Anything that any wisdom, there was a purpose for it, though, but that's not the purpose of this talk. But so we have a third meaning of the star. As Rosicrucian students, being familiar with the mysteries, we have the interpretation that Heindel gives very, very beautifully. It didn't originate with Heindel. The first place that I've seen it in history is Plutarch speaks of it when he talks about the mysteries of the ancient world. It's literally spoken of by, in of all things, the golden ass of Apuleius, by Lucius of Apuleius, which is called a ribald story, but it's a ribald story that is actually a mystery story. And he talks about his initiation at Christmas time into the rites of Isis, and he proclaims, "We who have seen the midnight sun." We know from the Rosicrucian interpretation that when we are ready, the appearances, the walls of the material world come tumbling down, and we can see the sun at midnight right through the earth. In some cases, people even scream because they have so much confidence they place in material stuff that suddenly they realize that what they're in is a world of energy, that it's a little bit discombobulating. But this is getting awfully long, and I don't want to be too long, so I want to pass on to one more interpretation of the star that is associated with the mysteries, because I think it's really important for setting the tone of what we're trying to do. It also comes from the Egyptian mysteries. In the Egyptian mysteries, the candidate for initiation was put through rigorous tests. Physical tests, not just of fasting, but of physical prowess. Moral tests, much like the ancient Greeks used to get a person drunk to see whether they could handle being exposed to greater forces and still be moral people. That was before the Christian initiation. And mental trials. And when the candidate had passed all of the trials for initiation, they were paraded before the public. And before the public, what they did was a most wondrous thing. They reached out into the sky, and they took the sun, and they put it in your forehead, and said, "This is the eye of God." It was a most wonderful, wonderful thing. When one has the star in the center of the forehead, every direction is facing east, no matter where you point. And exactly like the Egyptian initiate, one says, "I can't use this for myself. This is the eye of God." When one once has the spiritual vision, you can't use it for yourself. I know of a case of one initiate who saw a threat on his own life. By clairvoyance, he stumbled across it when looking into something else, and he would not protect himself because he could not use his clairvoyance for his own end. And what happened is somebody else inadvertently stumbled across the plot, and the person's life was saved anyway. But it's just like that. So we'll look a little bit at the star. I want to look at, to get to where we want to get to, because we do have points that we're trying to get to. This is not just a pedestrian stroll. I want to look at one more thing, and that is the gifts. Now, mind you, we're still in Matthew's Gospel yet. We could have gone into Luke and done the same thing. We could go on and on and on. There are 3 gifts that were given to Jesus: frankincense, myrrh, and gold. Now, most people look at those as being just precious things that were given. They were precious, but they were precious for another reason. All of those were essential to the ancient mysteries. Because before Christ, one had to be entranced, and it was a dangerous process. One had to be entranced and taken out of the body very carefully by spiritual hierophants. And even then, it was a dangerous, a precarious task. All of the gifts that were given to Jesus were used in the process of the ancient initiation. I'll go a little bit into the details. Frankincense was liquefied in hot goat's milk, and somebody drinking hot goat's milk with frankincense in it was elevated out of the body. It was part of the way for separating one from the physical body. I hate to say things like that because the first thing you know, somebody's going to run out and get frankincense and, and try and drive himself out of the body. Myrrh, on the other hand, was used as frankincense. That is, in the process of burning myrrh as an incense, it had the same effect of lifting one out of the body. And gold, we all know about gold that put into certain geometric shapes. With someone who knows how to use it, gold is used for transducing etheric energy from the etheric realm into the physical realm. That all of what we try to do now with splitting atoms and things like that could be done simply with gold if people knew how to do it. And this was used to transduce energy. You know what the name for gold was in the ancient world? Orium, where our word aura comes from, the gold of our aura. And the process of focusing energy and the stratification of the etheric vital body was accomplished or helped out by the use of gold. So you understand what this is saying? This is saying that when the wise men gave these gifts to Jesus, they weren't just giving gifts. They were saying, we recognize the old ways are done. No more are we going to have to entrance people. We recognize now that there is a new light and that there is a new consciousness, and that initiation will now be done in a different way. It'll be done in full waking consciousness, and it will be so because of the influx of the Christ. Okay, that's where we're trying to get to. We're trying to talk about the central purpose of Christ in the cosmos. If we begin, we can look at the whole story allegorically. We can look at the marriage of Mary and Joseph as their marriage of head and heart, where the feeling and the thinking are unified. And from that, a Christ is born within. But then there is the flight into Egypt. And the Egypt is always, the flesh pots of Egypt always have to do with the lower part of the body. And finally, the life of Christ is arising back to Jerusalem. And we all know that the Jerusalem represents the cranium with its 12 cranial nerves that are used for different kinds of spiritual consciousness by the initiate. So we can say that we can look allegorically at the whole story as being a cycle of the life energy that comes from the sun that proceeds down and back up the spine. We can do those things, and I think those are all fruitful. And those are things that we should do when we contemplate and when we meditate on the Bible. All right. We've looked at some of the individual little symbols. Now we said we were going to do a little bit of synoptic tying together. We could, I don't want to look any more into Luke's gospel because it would just get to be too much. We said that Matthew's gospel was a gospel of staunch moral rigor. Luke's gospel is a gospel of feeling. There are all of those stories from the spikenard of ointment and all of those things, so that Luke's gospel turns out to be something of an emotional, feelingful gospel. I want to look at the gospels a little bit in a comparative way. This is not original. A lot of people have looked at it. Mark's gospel, by the way, is the gospel that is most historically and traditionally is the one that is most corrupted. Each of the Gospels is associated traditionally in the mysteries with one of the vehicles of humanity. We said Luke's Gospel was associated with feeling, so that's associated with the desire body. Matthew's is associated with the physical. Mark is associated with the etheric body. This is Mark's gospel has to do with all the etheric healing, and the etheric healing currents change. You notice all of the healings, especially in Mark's gospel, occur right after sundown, and that time when it seems to be easiest to be in touch with the fairy kingdom. That moment just after sundown, the magic colors come out and everything. That's when most of the healings were done by Jesus. Because that's when things change. This is obvious has to do with the mind. Now that's all pretty straightforward. We understand that pretty clearly. But we have the other tradition that Matthew is associated with the Aquarius. Mark is associated with Leo. In fact, you can go into an Orthodox bookstore. These are the 4 animals on the cherub of Ezekiel. Luke is associated with Taurus, the bull's head, and Scorpio with the eagle. All of the members of the Sphinx or the cherub of Ezekiel are associated each with one of the Gospels. So Venus, it's not surprising then that we would find in Luke's Gospel a Venusian quality of loving and caring. In fact, you can find these things going all the way through. In fact, if you carry it even further, the last two Gospels, which are probably the most inspiring Gospels, I don't even care to read the first two. I listened to the whole New Testament on the way driving out here. I got the American Bible Society tapes for the New Testament, and one day I listened to the four Gospels, and the next day the major epistles, and then the last day the minor epistles and Revelation. And it's a really amazing thing. The things you hear, it's very much like driving across the country. When you drive across the country, you see one kind of geography and geology flow into another. And you can understand why sodbusters and that kind of mentality would be on the Great Plains and why cowboys would be in the mountains, because you can just see the stark differences unfolding for you. And when you're doing something like that, you're going through a process like that and then hearing the whole Bible, it's an astounding kind of thing. It's hard to keep your head on the highway. But Luke's Gospel is the seer's gospel. It says right away in its opening chapters, this is for those of us who have seen. Whereas John's gospel is for those of us who have been hearers of the word. And that immediately verifies the truth of this, because feelingful people are much more likely to be ocular people, people who are looked to the eye. Whereas mental people, well, we even know that like for example, Uranus, which is the mystic's planet, has to do with the optic nerve and the light ether. And the reflecting ether and the auditory nerve are ruled by Neptune, and that has to do with the thinking mind of the occultist. So we can, I've opened up something again that's enormous, and the whole frustration of all of these talks is going to be that there's so much to say, and there's going to be no chance to say it all, because there's just so much of it. So I guess I'm going to have to. Every blessing has its curse built right into it. This is the irony of all of that was understood by the Greeks in their mythology with, like the torches of Tantalus. We have all of these things right in front of us, and we can't grab them all. I want to look synoptically then at Matthew and Luke. Matthew's gospel is clearly a gospel of history, of prophecy, and of politics. If we look in the Nativity, in the short 2 chapters, there are 5 dream revelations. And it's just like the book of Revelations in the Bible says, your old men shall dream dreams. For us, as occult students, when we dream dreams, that's a sign that we're really not growing on the spiritual path, because we're too much into the material world. We should leave the body clean when we leave at night. If we retrospect successfully, if we give ourselves totally to the material world when we're in it and then let go, we shouldn't have to come back and dream. But it's not surprising then that Matthew's gospel, being attached to the physical, would have all the dreams to it. Also, in the 2 short chapters, there are 5 relations to historical prophecies. And this is for people that are earthly. The prophecies are material records. So like all the political, it's a totally different kind of consciousness, because when we look at Luke, very, very different. In the 3 short chapters that cover the Nativity in Luke, I got it written down here, there are 4 direct visions. They are all seers' visions. And there are either 4 or 5 direct experiences of the Holy Spirit, which is not surprising, since the desire body is the reflection of the human spirit, and that's exactly what we'd expect to find in there. Now, the point that I'm trying to get to, hey, we're going to do this in under 90 minutes. By golly, I think those people do it. We're on page 9, we only have 11 pages of notes, and that's easy. The point that I'm trying to get here, and this is a really important point that we always have to keep in mind, especially if we study things like astrology, is that each of these Gospels is for a different kind of people. And if we happen to be hearers of the Word, that does not mean we should discriminate against people who need the physical records. That anybody who studies astrology realizes that there are more than one way, there is more than one way to paint a picture. And the more ways there are to paint a picture, the more kinds of pictures we're going to have, and the fuller the world that we're going to have. So this says a number of things, but there's one essential point that I'm trying to get to. The Gospels are unique in terms of initiatory myth, in that all 4 Gospels are about the same being and the same event. In all of the ancient world, before Christ, each country, each mystery school had its own myth, and it was completely separate or different. What we're saying is that in Christ, in the Christ mystery, there is a unity where people coming from different points of view can focus on the same event and on the same being and attain to initiation. What we're talking about here is a very singular, central kind of event. This is a rare occurrence. In fact, it's a singular occurrence. That this is the one in which all things are united. Now, this is really a fascinating thing. Sigmund Freud, for example, said that it was a blessing that psychoanalysis had to come to a Jew because the Jews are not mystical, and anybody else would have taken psychoanalysis and made something mystical of it. And the claim is made by some occultists that it is this very thing that the Jews gave to humanity. That the Jews, in their very down-to-earth, non-mystical way, maintained a central, singular, exoteric, historical monotheism. And that was their gift to evolution. On the other hand, because of that, they couldn't have all the different flavors of the mysteries. And the claim is that different prophets had to be born, come out of the mysteries of other tradition and then be reborn into Judaism so that they could get all of the, it's sort of like saying if you're highly, centrally, rigidly monotheistic, you have to depend on other people for your variety. The Jews got their numerology from the Babylonians, they got their tarot from the Egyptians, so they had to be borrowers. All right, that's not the point I'm fully trying to get to. The point I'm trying to get to is that not only are the Gospels unifications of 4 points of view on one being, but they contain within them the symbols of all of the mysteries. This is something I've just gone wild with for the last 8 or 9 months. I've been doing a mythology class called Mythology and the Mysteries. It's going to run about 3 or 4 years long before I get all of these said that I want to talk about. But the myths were literally the story of initiation. The whole cosmology is interwoven through all of the different myths. But there were special myths that were mystery myths, like the myth of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Out of all the panoply of gods that they had in Egypt, the one mystery myth was the Isis, Osiris, and Horus. In Greece, there was the Eleusinian mysteries, where it was based on the myth of Demeter and Persephone, and on the myth of Orpheus. And in each of these mysteries, there were specialized little symbols. And do you know that all of those symbols, or many of the major symbols that go all the way from the Indian mysteries, the Greek mysteries, are in the 4 Gospels? It's astounding to me, because I'm reading the Gospels all over in a totally new way. This dawned on me that, I just never... I'll give you some examples. There are some things that are very hard to take in the Bible, like the decimation of the fig tree. Because the fig tree wasn't bearing fruit, it was killed out of season by Jesus. Now, are you familiar with the Eleusinian mysteries? In the Eleusinian mysteries, one of the things that was done, in fact, this is in the mysteries of Isis and Osiris also. The coffin of Osiris ends up inside of a tree, and they hew the tree apart. In the Eleusinian mysteries, it was called telete, meaning the lopping off of the limbs. And this same process is the process that is identical to what we do in retrospection, where we get rid of the unnecessary things in our life. And it was a fig tree because the fig tree was associated with flowering and fruit at the same time. In the Mideast symbols, the figs were always associated with fruitfulness. And this is a fruitfulness that comes by lopping away all the limbs. So all of the little stories, like the second day, I believe, of the first day of the Eleusinian mysteries, there were 9 days that they celebrated. The first day was called the Grand Convocation. But the second day goes back to the story of Euboleus, who was one of the children of the king that harbored Demeter when she was looking for Persephone, when Persephone was down in the underworld. And Euboleus was a swineherd. And on the second day of the celebration of the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, everybody went down to the sea. In fact, that day was called to the sea. And they sacrificed pigs, and often they drove the pigs into the sea. Now, you recognize this story in the Gospels? That is a story about driving out the demons, but it is also a story that has to do... Now, I won't go into the meaning of that myth, but those symbols of all of the mysteries are also unified in the Christ story. And that's the point that we're trying to get to. When we're celebrating Christmas, when we're celebrating the Christian initiation, the birth of the new Christ into the earth, we're celebrating just that, the unity of everything. Now, to come back to our final thing, we have to do it like a symphony, and a symphony always ends where it began, and this talk is called the Nativity. The Nativity. We know that a nativity is a natal horoscope. The Nativity is the natal horoscope for all of mankind. All great heroes and saviors were born of virgins at this time of the year. But not singularly. Christ represents the hero's hero. The unification of all of the saviors is found in this oneness, which is going to be our topic of our talk for tomorrow. And as much as studying the Bible is a wonderful thing for us, we are admonished by Max Heindel that the whole path of initiation is told and retold in many ways in the stars. And that the nativity for the cosmos is shown in the stars. I brought along, this is an old one, I don't have a really modern, decent one, but this is a picture of the stars it's been one of my big textbooks. In the mythology class I've been doing, I found all sorts of wondrous things that have never been there before. You know that when we're told in our teaching that one of the interpretations of a myth is astrological, that every myth has an astrological interpretation, every one has a physiological interpretation, and thus and so. Let me see, let me turn this to the right area here. All right. No, it's going to be difficult. But take it and look at it. If you put it in this wise, so that Virgo is on the ascendant, and then look at this as being the midheaven, you'll find that on one side of the heaven you find Luke's Gospel, and on one side you find Matthew's Gospel. The Nativity is there. On one side there is the bull and the sheep and the shepherd. In fact, there is even the mean old king and queen are there, and the decapitator is there. Instead of it being the decapitator of John the Baptist, of Medusa, it's the decapitator of John the Baptist. On the other side, the three bright stars in the belt of Orion have always been known, going back thousands of years, as the three wise men. The ass that was ridden upon, Balaam's ass, is in that side of the heavens, and Virgo is on the ascendant. Every time we look out into the universe at midnight at this time of the year, we're looking at the Nativity. We're looking at the natal horoscope, the radical horoscope for the center of all humanity. That being is Christ. So that is the event that we are celebrating for tonight and the next 11 days. And we're going to look at the life of Christ and the life of the Christmas story. Only we're going to look at it in a very transcendental way. And it's going to be, I guess, in the modern street parlance, it's going to be in-your-face occultism. Everything that we have been taught about the Christ mystery and about the spiritual worlds, we're going to look it in the face and say, what does this mean? What does this mean in our lives? How can we experience it every day in a way that we know it? And that is our objective. And so we've looked a little bit at the Nativity tonight, and that's all we have to say.